Have you ever found yourself in need of a certain size of airframe tube only to find the commercially available options were either too large or too small? My name is James Duffy, and for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to show you how I solved this little problem. You'll be able to use this technique to make tubes that are exactly the right size for your competition and sport models, as well as to create perfectly sized components for scale models. Let's take a look at a couple of fiberglass airframe tubes. This is an ultra lightweight airframe built for FAI competition, and it has an outside diameter of 40 millimeters. It is very, very light, and it's perfect for its task. It is also very, very fragile. At the other extreme is this 2.6-inch airframe tube, which I have on hand for a planned Honest John scale project. It's very strong, but frankly not what I would call light. In fact, this puppy weighs a full 165 grams, or almost 6 ounces. So we've got tubes at these two extremes. What if we need something that theoretically resides in the vast gulf between the two? Here's an example. This is a fiberglass tube laid up on a 30 millimeter mandrel, and it consists of 3 layers of half-ounce fiberglass cloth and a single layer of Japanese tissue. I made this for a Black Brant scale altitude model, but it could be used on any number of rockets. You can make a really cool minimum diameter model with a 29 millimeter motor, for instance. It's remarkably strong, yet it only weighs 1 ounce, or about 28 grams. So here's our plan. We're going to make a few more glass tubes like this in a variety of sizes. Let's start by going over the stuff we're going to need. The first thing we'll need is fiberglass cloth. This is a bag of half-ounce cloth. This is extremely light, fine stuff. It's sold in either half-ounce, 6/10 of an ounce, or 3/4 ounce weights, and it's extremely light and extremely fine. Before it gets epoxy applied to it, it is also very fragile. You can get this from SIG Manufacturing, ACP Composites, and I've also been able to source it off of Amazon. We'll also need some Japanese tissue. This is the stuff that's used by stick and tissue modelers to make very light model aircraft. And we're going to use pieces of it to line the inside of the structure we create. This is available from SIG Manufacturing as well. We're also going to need some epoxy. I use West Systems 105 epoxy resin. It is a industrial grade product, and I use the 206 slow hardener. This is also what's known as a laminating epoxy. It's a slow drying epoxy, and it will give us plenty of time to work with our fiberglass cloth as we create our tubes. I like to keep these in this little tray that I liberated from the kitchen, just to keep everything clean and neat in the workshop. We'll also need a mandrel over which we can lay our fiberglass cloth. These come in any size you want. They can be stock sizes of aluminum tubing like this, or they can be custom machined. I'll show you a custom machined one in a moment. This particular mandrel is thick wall aluminum tubing that is 24 millimeters in diameter. If you wanted to make a all fiberglass Estes Alpha, this is the mandrel you would start that project with. That rack of K&S brass tubing at your local hobby shop is also another great source for mandrels. This is a 1/2-inch brass tube that I've used to make airframe tubes for WAC corporal sustainer stages for many years. This is a 25 millimeter aluminum tube that I sourced from a place called Metric Metals, and it's great for making scale altitude airframes. Here's the 30 millimeter version of that very same tube. Again, it was sourced from Metric Metals. Here's an 18 millimeter tube that I used to make the sustainer airframe for a larger bumper whack model. Finally, you can have mandrels custom machined as well. This is a 31.8 millimeter mandrel that I had custom machined for my 1/12 scale Little Joe model. This is Crown 3470 mold release. It's probably the most critical element in this entire process. It is a sprayable wax, and we are going to cover each of our mandrels with several generous coats of this before we apply the epoxy and fiberglass. After the fiberglass cures, we can then apply heat to the mandrel, and the tube should theoretically slide cleanly off of the mandrel. It's a little bit tricky to source, and there's no viable alternative that I've ever been able to locate. I source it directly from the manufacturer. I believe the minimum quantity is 6 or 12 cans. Perhaps if you decide to go down this route, you might share a case with a friend or two. We'll need a bunch of these disposable chip brushes. I get these at Home Depot. They're also available from Amazon. Should cost about $1 a piece. We'll use these to apply the epoxy to the mandrel and to the tube layup. And then when we're done, we'll just throw them away. We'll also need mixing sticks. These are standard popsicle sticks. You can get them from Amazon or Michael's or Hobby Lobby. Again, they're disposable. Use them once and throw them away. Now, in my experience, there's only one way to reliably cut the fiberglass cloth we'll be using, and that's with a self-healing cutting mat and a rotary cutter. That's the only way to get through the material without moving it around as we cut. We'll also need rubber gloves. This is non-negotiable. I also recommend that you wear an old shirt and have old jeans on as well. Finally, I've found it makes an immense amount of sense to have a work holder handy. This is a plywood and scrap wood holder that I've developed over the years, into which I can set a mandrel as I apply the cloth onto it. You'll see this used a lot during this whole process. I've made it adjustable so that I can lengthen or shorten it for different size mandrels. I can also set a dowel into it in case I need to make something on an unusually short mandrel. Here are the mandrels I've chosen for this little demonstration, with the choice driven by specific needs I have right now. I'll need a short 18 millimeter airframe for the second stage on a bumper whack project, and I'll also need a short 24 millimeter stuffer tube for that same model. I'll also need a long 30 millimeter airframe for a scale sounding rocket. I haven't decided what prototype that model will be based on quite yet, but I know that it will be 30 millimeters in diameter. Okay, we're in the paint booth / horse trailer to spray our mold release. Use this stuff just like paint. The only difference perhaps being you spray it on a little bit heavier. It goes on glossy. I like to put about 4 coats on each mandrel, letting it dry about 5 to 10 minutes between coats. Here we are with our 30 millimeter mandrel. You'll note that I'm putting a dowel in place to ease holding. This can is about to give out, but I think I can get a coat out of it. You might find this interesting. It's a simple wooden rack with dowels in it that I use to keep the mandrels upright between coats of mold release. I've got it clamped to the desk where I'm actually working on this video project right now. Now that our mandrels have been slimed up with mold release, let's talk about the structure of our tubes. The tubes are made up of a single layer of tissue followed by 2 wraps of the glass cloth. I like a balance between strength and lightweight, so I usually use 2 wraps of glass. People often ask if the tissue is necessary, and from my perspective it is, absolutely. It's far less porous than the fiberglass and provides a pretty solid gas vapor barrier. That means it comes in handy if the tube needs to withstand an ejection charge. Just as important, it makes it a great deal easier to get the tube off of the mandrel easily without damage. Now, I'm not an engineer, but I think that what happens is that the variety of materials makes the structure stronger. We'll need to cut a piece of tissue a bit longer than our anticipated tube size. For our 18 millimeter tube, that'll be about 9 inches or 225 millimeters. For our 24 millimeter tube, that's about 10 inches or 250 millimeters. And for the 30 millimeter tube, that's a lot longer, that's 23.5 inches or about 600 millimeters. Now, I've already got the piece of tissue for that 30 millimeter tube cut. We'll just need to cut the tissue for the smaller diameter tubes. The tissue needs to wrap around our mandrel with a tiny bit of a fudge factor. That's the tube diameter times pi plus a fudge factor. For our 18 millimeter tube, here's the math. 18 millimeters times pi plus, let's add 4 millimeters equals about 61 millimeters. We'll need a piece of tissue that is 61 by 225 millimeters. The 2 wraps of glass for that tube will be about 117 by 225. For our 24 millimeter tube, that's 24 millimeters times pi plus, let's give it about a 5 millimeter fudge factor, works out to about 76 millimeters. Here we'll need a piece of tissue that's 76 times 250 millimeters and a piece of glass that's about 155 times 250. Here's the tissue for our 18 millimeter tube. This needs to be 61 millimeters. I'll put a little tick mark here on the tissue in a couple different places, by 225 millimeters. We're going to use a rotary cutter to cut the tissue along with a straight edge. And there's the tissue for our 18 millimeter tube. For our 24 millimeter tube, I've got a tissue that's already the right width. I just need to cut it to the correct length of 250 millimeters. And here we have all the tissue we need for our 18, 24, and 30 millimeter tubes. Let's cut some fiberglass. I found a pre-cut piece for our 30 millimeter tubes, so we only need to cut the glass for the 18 and 24 millimeter tubes. Again, the 18 millimeter glass will be 117 millimeters high by 225 millimeters wide. I like to use a Sharpie to denote where I need to cut. The grid background helps a lot here. Now let's do the 117 millimeter dimension. And there's the cloth for our 18 millimeter tube. Next, our 24 millimeter fabric will be 155 millimeters high by 250 millimeters. We're ready to lay up our first tube. I've got the 18 millimeter mandrel on a dowel that we've suspended in our holding stand right now. I've also got a mixing cup, a brush, a mixing stick, our fiberglass cloth, and the tissue handy. And just off camera, I've got our West Systems 105/206 epoxy ready to go. I'm going to step off camera for just a moment and mix up the epoxy we'll need. We'll begin our tube layups with the 18 millimeter airframe. The epoxy is dabbed onto the mandrel with the chip brush rather than brushed. Next, the tissue is placed onto the tube. Note how the tissue soaks up the epoxy much like a sponge. I'm gently pushing the tissue down into the wet adhesive, and the tissue even changes color to let you know that the process is working. Just slowly rotate the mandrel until all the tissue is in place. Next, bring the fiberglass cloth into position over the mandrel. Ideally, the edge of the cloth will attach to the layup in a straight line, but don't worry if it doesn't. Any irregularities of that line will be self-correcting due to the flexibility of the light cloth. Just like the tissue, gently push the fabric into the adhesive. The color of the cloth will change a little bit as it saturates. Keep an eye out for any wrinkles or air bubbles that might pop up and gently work them out. Slowly work the fabric around the tube 2 times. If you need to add a bit of epoxy to a thin area, go ahead and just dab that area with your brush. I like to wet my gloved finger in some rubbing alcohol to smooth out the layup. The alcohol acts as a mild solvent or a thinner, and it makes the final finish a bit smoother, which means less sanding. If there's any flyaway threads of fiberglass cloth still sticking up at this point, don't sweat it. Those will come off easily when we sand the tube later. Finally, I like to wrap some waxed paper over the layup and tape it in place. This step seems to provide a slightly smoother post-cure finish, which again means less sanding. The waxed paper will stay in place until the tube is completely cured. Next, let's move on to our 24 millimeter tube. The process is exactly the same, but you'll notice that the amount of epoxy needed goes up exponentially as tube diameter increases. Again, we're dabbing the epoxy adhesive on rather than brushing it into place. Our tissue then goes into place and we slowly work it around the mandrel. I like to work from the center of the mandrel out to the ends. That seems to produce fewer air bubbles and distortions of the fiberglass cloth. We'll do our rubbing alcohol treatment next. And finally, our waxed paper goes into place. Let's move on to the big tube. The handling stand has been reconfigured to handle the much longer 30 millimeter mandrel. As before, we'll start by dabbing the epoxy directly onto the mandrel. This tube will take much more epoxy as it's significantly longer than the previous 2 tubes we made. Our tissue goes into place. Again, note the color change. Now our cloth is in position. Again, I'm working from the center of the tube out to the ends. We'll do our little rubbing alcohol trick next because we like anything that means less sanding later. And the waxed paper goes into place. I like to position the tubes vertically as they cure. The handling rack I used after we applied the mold release is great for this. Now this is a really thin layup, so we're going to let the tubes cure for a good 4 to 5 days before we move on. We've allowed the tubes to cure for several days and we've removed the wax paper. They look pretty good, especially the 18 and 24 millimeter tubes. There are some spots where it's clear that I didn't put quite enough epoxy on the 30 millimeter tube, but perhaps we can salvage that with a little bit of primer, additional primer during the finishing process. The first thing I'm going to do is set the 30 and 24 millimeter tubes to the side and show you how we sand these. Before we remove them from the mandrel, I like to polish them real quickly with 240 and then 400 grit sandpaper. The idea is just to remove any loose fiberglass threads that might be on here. Now the 400 grit. This 18 millimeter tube is going to look fantastic when we're done. I'll repeat the process on the 24 and 30 millimeter tubes, and then we'll move on to removing them from the mandrels. Operations have moved into the kitchen where the oven behind me is currently heating up to 250 degrees. We'll use that oven to heat the 18 and 24 millimeter tubes up, melting the wax and hopefully freeing them from the mandrel. I have gloves on and the kitchen island has been protected with an old towel. We'll start with the 18 millimeter tube. It should take about a minute to get the mandrel up to temperature. A sure giveaway is the appearance of little tiny wax dots on the external surface of the tube. That means that the wax has gone liquid. Okay, I think we're ready. Note how the tube is slipping on the mandrel. Gently draw it down the mandrel. Be careful that you don't crush it as you remove the mandrel. Be very careful with it for the first hour or so. Let it come up to room temperature. And we're ready to try the 24 millimeter tube. Okay, we're ready to go with our 24 millimeter tube. Gently slide it off the mandrel. Careful not to crush the tube. And we're ready to prime that tube. Removing the tube from the 30 millimeter mandrel is a little bit trickier. Once we heat it up, we'll need a little more leverage than simply grabbing the end of the tube. Note that I've drilled a couple of holes through the walls of the tube up here at the end. We're going to place a piece of wire through there to create a stop. That will allow us to insert a wood pole to gently ease the tube off the mandrel after it's heated. We'll also need a larger heat source than a standard oven. The grill on my back porch is how I solved that little problem. I've placed a couple of blocks up here on the upper rack. I'll set the tube in there. and let it heat up for a couple of moments. Okay, when the tube gets to medium rare, we pull it off, put the tube in place, and begin gently pulling. Careful, you don't want to crush the tube. And our tube is off the mandrel. All three tubes have been removed from the mandrels and have also been sanded with 240 grit paper. From this point forward, we're going to treat them much like we would standard paper tubes. The only difference is that we're priming and sanding to fill the cloth weave rather than a paper spiral. Speaking of primer, we'll be using Rustoleum Automotive primer, which is the same stuff I use on paper tubes. We're back out in our horse trailer / paint booth, ready to apply the first layer of primer. Just like paint, we start off the part and finish off the part. We'll let that dry for about 4 to 5 hours, sand it off, and then do another layer. Here's our big 30mm tube. We're sanding our 18mm tube here. It turned out very nicely. We're starting with 240 grit sandpaper. We'll move to 400 and then 600 grit sandpaper. Now each tube will require a different number of cycles. I've had fiberglass tubes that I've been able to get complete in 2 or 3 cycles of primer and sanding, and I've had tubes that took 7 or 8. Our 24mm tube looks even better, which is ironic because I built this to be a stuffer tube and the cosmetics really don't matter here. I'll probably stop at 2 cycles of primer and sanding on this particular tube. The 30mm tube is not quite as elegant as the other two. Still, it turned out pretty well. I'm pleased with it. It'll certainly work for a boilerplate model or a sport model. It may not work for a competitive scale model, but it's certainly a usable tube. That brings us to the conclusion of this demo. I'll continue with the priming and sanding operations on these tubes, but I think you get the idea at this point. I should mention that there is a learning curve associated with this process. Don't expect your tubes to be perfect right from the start. Hopefully, though, this demo will help make the learning curve a little less steep. So, thanks again for watching.